Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the absolutely staggering life of Lord Mountbatten. He's this incredibly complex figure whose personal rise directly mirrors the dramatic, often violent transformations of the modern world. We're going to examine the fascinating trajectory of a man who transitioned from literal Victorian royalty to a supreme military commander, and ultimately to the last Viceroy of India. Picture this. It's August 27th, 1979. A completely calm, beautifully sunny day off the coast of County Sligo in Ireland. Lord Mountbatten, who's well into his retirement by now, is just enjoying a peaceful summer holiday at his castle estate. He heads out onto the calm waters to check some lobster pots with his family, completely unaware of what had been planted aboard his boat. But that piece, it was shattered in an absolute instant. An IRA bomb, packed with 50 pounds of gelignite, went off and obliterated the vessel. It claimed the life of the 79-year-old Earl Mountbatten, his 14-year-old grandson, a local boy, and another family member. This event sent massive shockwaves right through Britain. I mean, it really forces us to ask, how did this royal insider, a genuine war hero to so many, become such a high-profile target of the Provisional IRA? To really understand this violent end, we actually have to rewind all the way back to his beginning. We need to trace his roots right back to the absolute peak of the Victorian era. And honestly, the sheer scale of his royal network is just staggering. He wasn't just born into the British monarchy. The guy was intimately tied to the major ruling houses of Europe. Born at Windsor in 1900, he was literally christened in the original royal gown from 60 years prior. Queen Victoria herself, that was his godmother. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, his godfather. Talk about a pedigree. Later on, this incredible web of connections made him a vital father figure to Prince Philip and a deeply beloved mentor to the future King Charles. He was the ultimate royal insider. So, born Louis to the German Battenberg family, his whole trajectory took a massive shift in 1914. World War I broke out, and a fierce wave of anti-German sentiment swept through Britain. It was so intense, it actually forced his father out of his role as First Sea Lord. Because of this, the family adopted the anglicized Mountbatten name. But here's the thing. That perceived slight, it lit a fire under young Louis. It drove a deep, deep ambition to prove all his family's detractors wrong. Fast forward to 1922, and he cements his high society status by marrying Edwina Ashley. She was an heiress with a frankly massive fortune, creating this absolute powerhouse union of royal blood and serious wealth. But here is the crucial point. Mountbatten didn't just coast on his royal pedigree or his wife's money. Not at all. He set out to build a genuine, gritty military career that would be severely tested in the fires of the Second World War. His military ascent was rapid, and it was harrowing. As commander of the HMS Kelly, his ship was right in the thick of it, constantly in danger, until it was eventually sunk by German bombers off the coast of Crete in 1941. He literally barely survived by swimming to safety. But you know what? His calm, steady leadership during that absolute chaos caught the eye of Winston Churchill. Talk about a turning point. Churchill vaults him right up to Chief of Combined Operations, coordinating the Navy, Army, and RAF. Then, at the 1943 Quebec Conference, he gets elevated again, named Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia. Now, it wasn't all smooth sailing. His operational command was marked by some fiercely debated events, specifically the Dieppe raid in 1942. History really looks at this in two distinct ways. On one hand, many view it as a disastrous, heartbreaking failure where 2/3 of the predominantly Canadian force were killed, wounded, or captured. It's a heavy toll. On the other hand, military planners often assess it as a totally necessary, albeit harsh, learning exercise. Essentially, a giant intelligence-gathering mission to figure out how a massive amphibious assault on France could actually succeed later on during D-Day. By 1943, he arrives in India to oversee a theater of war that was fraught with challenges that went way, way beyond simple combat. Just wrap your head around this number, 120 to 1. That is the staggering ratio of British soldiers forced out of active service by tropical diseases for every single soldier actually killed or wounded in combat in Burma. I mean, it completely redefined what fighting a war even meant in this region. So it quickly becomes clear that Mountbatten's role was just as much about high-stakes crisis management and disease control as it was about actually defeating the Japanese military. He shows up and finds the devastating Bengal famine, which tragically killed around 3 million people. He's battling those rampant malaria outbreaks we just talked about. He's facing unimaginable corruption from Chinese nationalist allies who are literally pilfering Western aid. And on top of all that, local allies were deeply, deeply suspicious of the British. They even joked that his command's acronym, CEAC, actually stood for Save England's Asiatic Colonies. Rough crowd, right? As the world finally transitioned from World War to the Cold War, Mountbatten was handed what might be his most monumental task yet, dismantling the very empire he grew up representing. He was appointed as the final British Viceroy of India. The decision to partition the subcontinent into India and Pakistan in 1947 remains intensely, fiercely debated to this day. One perspective argues that Mountbatten totally rushed the independence timeline, allowing it to happen way too quickly, which directly paved the way for the ensuing chaos. But the counter perspective, which was essentially Mountbatten's own defense, is that intercommunal tension was already spiraling completely out of control. The argument here is that delaying independence any further would have resulted in even worse, unimaginable violence between Hindus and Muslims. 1 million. We really have to pause on that number. That is the estimated human cost in lives lost during the massive migrations, rioting, and sheer chaotic violence of the Indian partition. Tens of millions of people were violently uprooted from their homes as borders were rapidly drawn, resulting in one of the largest and most tragic migrations in human history. Mountbatten himself later said, "The unrest made the management of the war in Southeast Asia look like a rather simple affair." That quote really captures the absolute desperation and the sheer scale of the crisis he faced. He was attempting to act as a military commander, imposing order over a completely unraveling subcontinent. He ended up treating the immediate aftermath of partition almost like a military campaign, desperately trying to restore some semblance of law and order to the major cities amidst this staggering human tragedy. Following that intense crucible in India, he eventually returned to his naval roots. But he had to adapt to a vastly diminished British global footprint in the post-war era. During this final administrative chapter of his life, his worldview had actually shifted considerably. He became head of the Mediterranean Fleet and then First Sea Lord. But 1956 is the really key year here. When the Suez Crisis erupted, Mountbatten pragmatically recognized that the old colonial playbook was dead. Former colonial powers simply had to work with local elites now. He directly and forcefully opposed the British government's disastrous military intervention in Egypt, going so far as to offer his resignation over it. He survived that political fallout, though, and was eventually appointed Chief of Defense Staff in 1959, where he focused on modernizing and unifying the massive British military bureaucracy. Now, as we move into his later years of retirement in Ireland, we really have to take an honest look at how his legacy has been scrutinized in the decades since his death. The source material we're looking at highlights some very severe allegations of abuse that surfaced years later, as well as the official investigations that followed them. There were claims stemming from old 1940s FBI files alleging improper private conduct while he was in the Mediterranean. And more recently, there were allegations of involvement in the horrific Kincora boys' home abuses in Northern Ireland. It's heavy stuff. However, to keep this completely balanced, veterans who actually served alongside him in the Mediterranean have unequivocally dismissed those earlier claims. And regarding Kincora, an official 2021 Historical Institution abuse inquiry explicitly dismissed the allegations against him, finding them to be totally without basis. Which brings us right back full circle to where this explainer started, the November 1979 conviction of his IRA assassin, Thomas McMahon. Mountbatten's assassination was a profound, chilling shock to the British establishment, and it absolutely devastated his mentee, King Charles. Charles spoke openly about the intense, agonizing anguish of losing the man he considered the grandfather he never had. In a really poignant mark of respect, Charles later added the name Louis to his son William's names, a tribute that, as you might know, was passed down again to the current Prince Louis. So, as we wrap up today, I want to leave you with this exact question drawn straight from our sources. It invites us all to weigh the incredible scope of his life against the controversies that constantly trailed him. Was he one of the great naval commanders and administrators of 20th century Britain? Or is his legacy permanently tainted by issues like the Dieppe raid and the chaos of the Indian partition? From a Victorian royal christening gown to the sweaty jungles of Burma, from the absolute heights of imperial India to the tragic waters of County Sligo, Lord Mountbatten's life was undeniably incredibly vast. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning history.